we are at the early stages of World War III. To many, this claim will appear hyperbolic, but objective analysis of long-term trends as well as recent and current events clearly point towards this direction. The plain truth is this: 2 out of the world's 3 strategically relevant regions are already large-scale war theaters. In Europe, Russia has already deployed and engaged in hostilities with substantial forces, in what they see as NATO-occupied historical southwestern Russia, a region known in recent decades as Ukraine. NATO, on their part, have provided military aid to Ukraine going well beyond the quantity and quality expected in a proxy or even regional war. The only escalatory step that NATO have avoided until now has been to officially use their own troops in hostilities against the Russian armed forces. Having said that, a non-insignificant number of volunteers or mercenaries from Western countries have already been deeply involved in the Ukraine war, mostly as operators of complex air defense and artillery systems far behind the line of contact. Battlefield casualties have already been acknowledged by the Western media themselves. The scale, intensity, and technological sophistication of the war in Ukraine has already far exceeded what could be categorized as a proxy or regional war. The events in Ukraine during the past 2 years can only be described as 21st-century great power conflict. In the Middle East, hostilities have been constant for over 2 decades now, sometimes ebbing and sometimes flowing, but ever since the surprise attack by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October, 2023, the geopolitical and military situation in the region has assumed an entirely different character. The State of Israel has been compelled, for the first time in its history, to mobilize and engage in combat operations with massive forces for an extended period of time. All previous large-scale campaigns involving Israel have been quite brief in terms of duration. As I write this, elite Israeli brigades are massing on their country's north, ready to clash with the South Lebanese-based Hezbollah militia. However, the Middle Eastern theater goes well beyond the immediate environs of the Levant. It in fact involves already active parties, or potential future belligerents, across the entire region. Added to the already mentioned participants, namely, Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, in the southwestern part of Arabian Peninsula have already succeeded in interfering with Israeli and Israel-allied commercial shipping, imposing substantial costs on trade for Israel and its European allies. The actions of the Ansar Allah movement, better known in the West as the Houthis, have predictably provoked an aeronaval response from the U.S. and their allies. To the east of Israel, Syria, led by President Bashar al-Assad, survivor of a long and brutal NATO-backed war against his country, is himself backed by Russia and Iran but has only managed to regain 2/3 of his territory. As to the east of the Euphrates River, the Americans along their Kurdish allies remain entrenched. Even further to the east, the long-suffering country of Iraq still remains under heavy U.S. influence and is struggling to regain its independence. Along the American presence in Iraq, there's a tense coexistence with even more Iranian-backed militia. This unstable situation often involves exchanges of fire between the Iranian-backed militia and the U.S. occupation forces. These incidents have intensified and expanded since the 7th of October, 2023, in both Iraq and Syria. Iran is of course the primary U.S. adversary in the region, boasting of an extensive network of allies and proxies across the region and now in an informal alliance with Russia, the West's bête noire. For the time being, 3 key states in the region remain on the sidelines, but could willingly, or otherwise, get involved as the conflict expands and escalates. I am of course referring to Turkey, Egypt and maybe even Saudi Arabia. Even though the conflict in the Middle East has not yet remotely reached the levels of intensity and scope seen in Ukraine, it is firmly on an escalation trajectory with most of the regional powers seemingly preparing for the battles to come. The only strategically vital region on the globe still at peace is the Western Pacific, yet here as well, tensions are on the rise, and preparations for a looming conflict are already well underway. The status of Taiwan is increasingly called into question, with China not taking anything off the table, while the US and its allies firmly opposed to a direct Chinese military takeover. Beyond Taiwan, the Chinese have been busy, constructing a network of artificial island bases in the disputed South China Sea for several years now. They are also expanding and modernizing their navy at a rapid pace. The Chinese are also expanding both their conventional and nuclear arsenals, and most indicative of all, they have been expanding the geographic scope of their military exercises in and around Taiwan. North Korea, by now a well-established nuclear power, are also strengthening their military potential, in close cooperation with Russia. The latter, on its part, has by now every reason to ally with North Korea, since the collective West has already imposed the harshest possible sanctions and is practically in a kinetic war against it. A Russia, and potentially, China-backed North Korea, presents more than a credible threat to the key U.S. allies in the region, namely Japan and South Korea. For their part, the U.S. and their allies have also been on the move. Japan is for the first time since World War II, rapidly expanding its defense budget and tightening its alliances with the US and Taiwan. South Korea has already provided Ukraine with massive amounts of artillery shells, and is also signing massive arms deals with Poland. They now find themselves under pressure from a Russia-backed North Korea, and have been on the receiving end of economic pressure from the Chinese. Finally, the U.S., which has a long-standing and extensive footprint in the Western Pacific region, from Japan and South Korea to Guam, has reached a new deal with the Philippines on 4 potential new bases in that country. This marks the likely return of U.S. forces in the Philippines for the first time since the early 1990s. Even though the Western Pacific remains relatively quiet for now, the actions of all key regional actors, coupled with secular trends in global economic power distribution, make for an extremely flammable situation. Finally, the fact that both in Europe and the Middle East, the strategic questions have already been posed and are now contested on the battlefield, it can then only follow that the same questions will be posed in the Pacific as well. If the fact that 2 out of 3 strategically relevant regions isn't enough to convince some that these are the early stages of World War III, then there are additional factors to consider. These factors are determinants of the global balance of power and are gradually reaching their breaking points. Firstly, I would mention the competition for global market share and technology between the West and China. We are now entering a phase during which the competition for market share between the West and China is approaching a breaking point. The era during which the West could afford and tolerate ever-growing losses to China will have to come to an end. If the West shies away from suppressing China's economy, then they will simply be defeated by the Chinese through peaceful means. Then, there's the economic position of countries like Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, and North Korea. For all these heavily sanctioned countries, it's clear that for as long as the West holds the reins of the global financial and trading systems, they will have to languish under vicious economic warfare. Their best way out is through cutting the West down to size. Related to the above is the US dollar's central role in the global financial and trading systems. This arrangement has multifaceted ramifications and implications, but for the time being, I would limit myself in saying that this is an unstable arrangement that benefits some states, but undermines others. China, and this is very crucial to understand, has been the main beneficiary of this arrangement in recent decades, since Western markets have been relatively open for it. Yet, both the Chinese and the Americans fully well understand that this mutually beneficial and cozy relation between them has an expiry date.